For the second segment, and Governor, I want to start it by going back to something you mentioned earlier on air traffic control. As we've already discussed, I think the fact that the Commission identified air traffic control as issue number one, it was the first recommendation in the report, generated a lot of surprise and attention and really put it out there as a public issue. You also talked about your frustration that in the years since more progress hasn't been made. And that maybe the Commission should maybe have gone a little bit further. Can you talk a little bit about the issue of privatizing air traffic control? Did the Commission seriously consider it? Is there a way to do it and maintain safety? Is that something that we should consider now?
I think it's fair to say that the Commission did consider privatization. In fact, some people recommended it, some strongly. And we looked at all forms of what privatization might look like. We also looked at models of government corporations such as TVA, the Post Office, and the Federal Reserve. In fact, we even had Paul Volcker come and speak to the Commission about the functional role of the Federal Reserve as an entity of government separate from some of the daily operations that afflict the FAA and air traffic control. So we did look at it. We even had a member of our Commission from the Federal Reserve, Sandy Pinalto, from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. But I think we went as far as we could get an agreement on the government corporation idea that we proposed in our report. We didn't just settle on what Congress wanted. We really looked at what we thought was the best approach to dealing with this issue and an approach that could garner enough votes on the Commission to make it basically a unanimous recommendation. And there were some other groups around government. Vice President Gore's Reinvention Government group was looking at this issue as well. So I think the subject was fully explored, but I don't think the right model and the right kind of support could be found to support something like that.
Well, you know, we talked before about the government shutdown and the lack of the funding, and clearly, you know, we have a problem. You talked before about getting the press's attention, and they seem mostly interested now in whether air traffic controllers are asleep or not, which really misses the point. You also talked about how the press was mostly interested in the 90s and whether planes would smack into each other, not really in the efficiency of the system and making it work better. So there's a little bit of political frustration in terms of not making that progress, not getting the government corporation idea or something that makes more financial sense implemented. Can you talk maybe about what might be done to generate that support and that understanding, to whether it's a government corporation or something else, but clearly what we have now doesn't generate the revenue that we need to generate, and clearly people don't, while it's an issue, don't understand air traffic control as well as they should.
Are you talking about things like the infrastructure bank?
Well, we're really talking more about air traffic control in this particular case, and getting something like the corporation idea accepted, or a fundamental change in the structure that may move it along.
Well, again, I think it's an educational process. You've got to be able to make the case for change, which means you have to paint where that change fits into the larger picture and what the impact of that will be, for good or ill. That's just not being done. Again, short-term interests dictate a lot of strategy. And if one wants to privatize or to go into a different direction than the current system with a government corporation approach, you have to anticipate not only the advantages that can be used to develop the message, but anticipate the opposition and counter it effectively. You know, if you were to go for the government corporation idea today, in the era of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I think you could anticipate the pointing of fingers and saying this model will not work. I happen to think that the recommendation of the commission would have worked had Congress decided to move in that direction. But something better than what we now have is required. And I think Congress and the administration and the industry itself really should be looking at the long-term impact of failing to do nothing to improve the system.
And it seems, just to, sort of to tie that together, it seems a big part of that is that Congress doesn't really want to give up power and a role that it has.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the committee chairs and the committee members who have jurisdiction over various pieces of the aviation system, you're taking away not only work but control and the ability to influence the expenditure of dollars for specific projects. But on the other hand, I would argue you have a lot to do to govern this country. With this approach, we can take that off of your plate of concern. It's not a message that's being delivered, however.
We talked about the lack of stable, predictable funding. You mentioned the infrastructure bank a minute ago, an idea very much in vogue. Not a new idea, but it's very much in vogue right now. A lot of people talking about it. It's one of the few bills in Congress that actually has bipartisan support. Senator Kerry and Senator Hutchison are both sponsors of that. Do you think something like that, an infrastructure bank, could help deal both with the problems we talked about earlier with funding infrastructure in this country in a general sense, and then also about air traffic control?
I think it depends on how the proposal is structured. As you say, infrastructure banks are not new to this country. They've been proposed before. Sometime after 1810, between 1810 and 1820, Henry Clay in Congress proposed an infrastructure bank. President Madison, as I recall, initially opposed an infrastructure bank idea, then supported it, and then on his last day in office vetoed the proposal. So, you know, the idea that this is somehow new should be discounted. What really matters is what is its role, what is its function, how will it be administered? And so you really can't judge it in the abstract. You really have to look at the specifics of the proposal. And again, that requires some careful analysis, not the political posturing, as to how this would improve the financing and the expansion of the efficiencies of our system. I happen to think that where we're missing the boat, if I can mix metaphors here,
The intermodal show.
is in state government, and I can't say for every state, but we separate in our budget process operations from capital projects. Local governments do the same. There's no major enterprise in this country that operates without a capital budget. But the federal government operates without a capital budget. No business operates in this country without considering the returns on the investment of capital. But the federal government does. So it seems to me a careful evaluation of the risk and the rewards of where major sums, major capital sums are placed is important. And nowhere is that more important than in the air traffic control field, where you have to install and acquire, design, develop, install and acquire a system that is expensive, requires large sums of money over time. The air traffic control system really just begs for it. And in my view, you don't have to make major dramatic changes in the way OMB operates. Right now, you can you would not have to reform OMB's Budget Enforcement Act. You can change the way you score the value of projects and take a look at the long-term returns on investments of these major projects over time, and then prioritize them so that you place your capital where you can expect the greatest returns. And ultimately, the government should move then from that approach to really looking at how a lot of other governments around the world, as well as state and local governments in this country, clearly have separate budgets, one for operations and one for capital. I think that would do as much to help air traffic control and the FAA as some of these other proposals, such as infrastructure banks.
You talked about the scoring issue, which is sort of an arcane issue, but it's very important, and oftentimes people on the Hill and an OMB hide behind that who maybe don't want to change for other reasons, and especially now I think the political climate in Washington that wants to see a dollar spent as a dollar spent. An investment they see as some kind of code maybe for
Spending.
For spending, and maybe any advice you have for people like me and others who are in that arena right now trying to get these attitudes changed in Washington.
Well, there's been a lot of interest in the industry over years, and I think even before our commission, about regulatory reform and creating some kind of a scoring system, and that that may work. I mean, we recommended it, but and as I recall, the recommendation was that there ought to be a regulatory budget so that you could look at the cost of regulations and measure that against the improvement in efficiencies and profitability of those that are subject to regulation. That's easier said than done, but because a regulation in itself may pass the cost-benefit test, and it's rational, it's reasonable, it's the sort of thing that would be desirable. But when you take them in the aggregate, then they impose a huge cost on the regulated. So I don't know. That was one way we wanted to address the question of whether a regulatory budget could be useful, but that hasn't gone anywhere, and I don't really see that as being all that useful. Frankly, all the complaints that you hear about regulation and the cost of it surprises me in a way, because it's as if they have forgotten the underlying source for the regulations themselves, and that's the statute. Who passes the statutes? Congress. If you think regulations are so burdensome, so costly, so undesirable, why rail against the agency that imposes the regulation? Change the statute. But you never hear that. That raises a different issue. But coming back to the question of how do you persuade the public about this, if you get down to these very small specific concerns, the danger is you lose sight of the much bigger picture and where this small concern fits. So it's not an easy question to answer, but then this is a complex industry, and I think sometimes we forget that.
One regulation in particular that I remember at the time we were surprised in some ways at the prominence of it in the statute creating the commission was noise. It was not only on that long laundry list, but it was also, there was a preamble that had 5 particular areas of regulatory reform and international competitiveness and so forth, and noise was the 5th of those 5. And obviously the airlines were very concerned at the time. We heard a lot about it, the mandate to phase out their stage 2, chapter 2 aircraft, and a lot of concern about the financial burdens on the industry and so forth. I know this is an issue you've worked on not only at the commission but after. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of that on the industry?
Well, flight by itself is going to create noise. And the closer you live to that noise, the closer you work to that noise, the more you're going to be annoyed by noise. But the airlines were quick to say, after the proposal to eliminate Stage 2 aircraft, that they couldn't live with it. They did. I think the airlines actually benefited from more fuel-efficient Stage 3 engines, and there will be others, as we know, as time passes. I think it's important for airlines to work with the communities in which airports are located. This is a partnership really between the convenience of the traveling public to a given location and the airlines that serve them and the airports that provide the capability of service. Noise will always be a problem. The question is how we can reduce that noise, make it more acceptable to the communities in which airlines and airports operate. But you will, no matter where you are, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, and the future chapters, there will be those who will complain about them. That's a part of the process. The question is, does a quieter, more fuel-efficient engine serve the interest of the industry and the communities that are being served? And my answer is yes.
Let's talk a little bit about, we talked about passengers before, passenger rights. There's a big move these days for passenger rights regulations, and some are saying it could be as burdensome as maybe the noise regulations might have been 20 years ago, the phase-out regulations might have been. Can you talk a little bit about that, and you know, certainly the role of airlines in customer service has changed over the years. If you're delayed, they no longer have to get you on the next plane or have to find you a place to sleep or a place to eat. With 90% load factors, it might be a day or two before you get out. So a lot of pressure there on passenger rights.
Yeah. You know, we'll talk a little bit, a few minutes about deregulation and the impact of that. But when airlines treat customer service as a cost center, then you can expect reductions in passenger service. I mean, it just stands to reason. So people want to fly where they want to fly. They want more service, cheaper fares. And so airline service has become more of a commodity. We have sky buses, and passenger service deteriorates. You have these long delays on the tarmacs and other things. So you can expect passengers to be upset. I think if airlines made a greater effort to deal with passengers and their needs, as they've promised to do periodically over the years, there wouldn't be these concerns about passenger rights and demands on the industry to respond to passenger inconveniences. I don't necessarily equate the noise and passenger rights issues. I think there's a big cost differential. Noise controls are a lot more expensive for the industry than, say, dealing with passenger rights. So to me, there may be somewhat analogous, but there's a big difference in my mind about the two.
We spent the last few minutes talking about particular regulations. Let's, as we move into the next phase of this discussion, talk about the overall debate between regulation, re-regulation, deregulation of the industry. Of course, the series that DePaul is doing is in many ways chronicling the evolution of that and how it's affected the industry, how it's affected the traveling public. The commission, your commission, studied the impact, the effect of deregulation. It was one of the charges that you had. It's hard to remember now, as I said earlier, that this was a really big deal at the time.
Yeah.
There was a big reaction afterwards when our findings came out from some. Can you talk a little bit about the findings of the impact of deregulation, positive, maybe negative, if any, and its contribution to the industry's problems at the time, and maybe the political fallout from all that?
Well, our findings were quite simple. We found that deregulation increased service and competition. Before deregulation, 3/4 of all routes had only one carrier, 3/4 without any competition. That's much different now. The consumer has greater choice. I think they've benefited from lower fares. And it may have taken the airline some time to learn to function in this new environment. I think they're still learning as they try to maintain capacity discipline, but I think they've probably gotten the message that the good old days of a cartel were over, and that deregulation means that increased service and competition serves the public interest, serves the consuming traveler, and frankly, I think will improve the bottom line of the airlines themselves. There were people who wanted us to consider re-regulation. I recall Senator Byrd of West Virginia saying that one of his major regrets about a vote was voting for deregulation. Senator Hollings of South Carolina, a major force in the Congress at the time, stated on the floor of the Senate in the debates on the creation of the commission that he preferred, wanted, desired re-regulation of the industry. When we talk about regulation and deregulation, I think it's important to understand we're really just talking about the deregulation of routes and fares. Regulation of other aspects of the industry continue, such as air traffic control. But deregulation, for the most part, and in the public mind, it really meant, and for the airlines, meant they could fly where they wanted, they could charge what the market would bear. So people like John Robson, former member of the Civil Aeronautics Board and a member of our commission, along with Fred Kahn, who, as I understand, has been a part of this oral history project, Senator Ted Kennedy, and many others, supported the idea of deregulation because they thought greater competition would benefit the consuming public. And I think history has borne that out. I do recall that when we issued our report and we were in favor of maintaining deregulation and against re-regulation, that Senator Hollings came up to some of us and said, "You didn't do what I asked." But I think everyone understood there was no way that the egg could be unscrambled.
Well, I think you raise an interesting point. The reasons to deregulate the industry in the first place had nothing to do with shedding some government responsibility or anything else. It really got to what you like to call the purpose of transportation, the movement of people and products. And I think a conscious decision at that time that the best way to do that was to deregulate routes and fares. Do you agree that that was really what was behind the initial decision to deregulate the industry?
I do. And clearly history reflects that it was a wise decision. I mean, today people can fly almost anywhere from almost any place. And in many cases, and I know it was one of our goals in Virginia, to say that we were one stop away from any other place in the world, and by air service. And I think that's an important way of stressing to the public the importance of investing in infrastructure, that given the integration of our economies globally and the increasing mobility of our population, the demographic changes of our population, suggests that people want to travel, and greater competition and lower fares makes that possible. And so whether one is a diplomat or an academic or a government official or a business executive or a family taking a vacation, it means greater opportunity. And for the industry, this is the thing that I've often failed to understand. Why is it that people don't understand that if you want to expand your market, you can't constrain it? I mean, if you want to expand markets, you have to expand the opportunities to enter those markets. And deregulation meant that airlines, looking at market studies and travel patterns, were in a position to move quickly to open up new markets, rather than having a CAB in Washington going through the Administrative Process Act of trying to determine which carrier could serve which city over what period of time. And that was just a time-consuming process that did not serve industry, except for those who benefited from it, and it did not serve the public. So I think, as I suggested earlier, the one good thing from our report was I think we put the nail in the coffin of re-regulation.
You talked before about the impact on the carriers, and there certainly you have some examples of carriers that have thrived in this environment, others that have struggled, and even some not current CEOs but some former CEOs, even Bob Crandall, who've recently said that perhaps we should look at re-regulation as they look at their balance sheet results and so forth. And I know you've had some interesting conversations with some of those people over the years about that. If one of those guys was sitting here with you right now, what would you tell him?
Forget it. You know, if you look at the airlines, just to pick up on your first point, take a look at Southwest, JetBlue, AirTran. They've certainly benefited. And as I mentioned earlier, passengers have benefited. Greater competition, greater service opportunities, lower fares. You could argue that the government has benefited. They don't have to maintain the Civil Aeronautics Board anymore. And everyone benefits from the deregulation side. I did allude to this earlier. The downside is that the airlines don't have to compete on customer service, and they don't. I mean, you fly one airline versus another, and the customer service is pretty much the same. If you treat it as a cost center, you're going to look for ways to reduce your costs, which then has an adverse impact on customer service, which then increases the customer frustration and the demands that something be done about it, which then in turn starts the re-regulation side of the debate over again. So, you know, I don't think there are very many people interested in re-regulation, and there just didn't seem to be any way for the commission to even recommend it. It didn't make people happy, perhaps, in some corners, but I don't think there was any way to go back, and I think that's a dead issue.
Let's talk about that a little bit. No way to go back. I know the commission report talked about that there was no way to go back. Was the decision made by the commission to move in that direction just simply because it would be too hard to go back? I mean, you talked about the benefits of deregulation, but obviously there was a discussion within the commission. There were a couple of commissioners you mentioned before who might have been interested in going back to that. Can you talk a little bit about not just you talked about the decision to ratify deregulation, but a little bit about maybe some of the discussion and thinking about why we didn't want to go back to re-regulation?
I don't think anyone could figure out how you would go back. I alluded to the metaphor of unscrambling the egg, but with few exceptions in government, I didn't sense any persuasive evidence that we should re-regulate. Within the industry, there may have been a few, but since deregulation, they were serving more markets, carrying more people. They had to reduce their fares in order to be competitive, but I always thought that was a good thing. And from the customer's point of view, deregulation just opened up worlds of travel for them. So while we had one or two members on the commission who were philosophically inclined in that direction, I mean, even they saw the handwriting on the wall. They didn't really, they didn't push that hard for it, and so we didn't recommend it. But as we've suggested throughout, at the time the commission was created, given the conditions of airlines losing money, airlines going out of business, huge increases in the price of oil, terrorism, the Gulf War, there were those who were saying we really ought to take another look at this whole subject of re-regulation. But upon closer scrutiny, upon intense focus, upon thinking these things through, I think everyone understood that we would not go back.
Well, it's interesting context. You know, the debate seemed, it was out there for the 15 years between the Deregulation Act and the 1993 Commission. And then obviously with the tough economic times, there's a lot of pressure to look at it. The Baliles Commission seemed to put that to rest, and you didn't hear much talk about that until recently, when Mr. Crandall and some others have raised it in the middle of an economic downturn. And you know, it just may be that we're destined to hear about this idea every time the economy tanks. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's true. And again, the cycles of history would suggest that when times are tough and answers are not readily available, the cry is do something. They're not quite sure what should be done. They just want something done. And I think history also reflects the importance of thinking through these things carefully, which I saw as the role of the commission. And I think history will be kind to the decision to put re-regulation back in the box.
You know, looking back, there was an awful lot of discussion at the time about there were a number of mergers that were going on, and how many airlines were over-leveraged and really had dug themselves the kind of deep hole that maybe Greece and Portugal and Italy have dug themselves now on a national level. But a huge amount of focus on that, and a huge amount of focus, maybe it's a subset of the re-regulation debate, but a huge amount of focus on ideas that would have the government take more of a role in looking at the financial fitness of carriers, whether they were over-leveraged, and trying to get involved in those decisions. You might call it backdoor re-regulation. I don't know, but there was certainly a lot of debate in the commission on that. There was a recommendation along those lines. Certainly Felix Rowan spent a lot of time talking about that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the financial strength of the airlines generated that discussion and recommendation pretty much. But the recommendation that a financial advisory group be created to work with DOT and the Secretary to look at the financial condition of airlines was really the result of DOT not exercising the authority it had at the time when these airlines got in trouble. I mean, I remember being stunned at the debt equity ratios of the carriers at the time. I don't recall the number, 80, 90%, 100%, and wondering how could they do that? I mean, how can they continue to operate? All they need is just one little disturbance and they're going under. So I think the discussion within the commission was DOT had sufficient authority to look over the shoulder of the carriers when financial conditions really threatened the safety of the public as well as the viability of the airlines. But because they didn't exercise that authority, it was thought that the creation of this advisory group of experts could perhaps give additional weight to the Secretary's decision to exercise the authority it already possessed. Our recommendation did not provide any additional authority for DOT or the Secretary other than to create this advisory body to advise the Secretary. It was that was a period of prolonged discussion for us on that issue, but one that we it was a compromise agreement. So I know that some people felt that that was a backdoor attempt at re-regulation, but remember, we were deregulation dealt with routes and fares. And so for those who try to take that recommendation and say this was a backdoor effort at re-regulation, I think really missed the point of the original intent of deregulation. And besides, we didn't offer any new authority, so and Congress never really moved on that situation. So.
No, and if I remember correctly, that was one of the 12 the Clinton administration didn't include in their
right
in their proposal.
Right, and I didn't really disagree with that.
I remember, of course, we talked about Felix Rohatyn really pushing that idea, and
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I remember you telling him that if he could agree with Herb Kelleher on something, then he was sure the commission would pass it. Otherwise, he wouldn't. So your legislative skills came into play there. And I remember that Felix and Herb got together on that. I remember also in the back of the report, John Robson wrote a fairly direct dissent to that particular recommendation, and Dan Casper took him on a little bit in the dissent page. So it generated debate even after we were done.
There was a little verbal wordplay there between two really bright, intellectually strong members of our commission. I was amused by it, but it didn't really detract from the overall recommendations of the report. So that's the kind of thing you just accept and say, okay, let's check that one off and move on to the next item.
Yeah. Well, you talked about DOT, the authority they already had. It's maybe less of an issue now, but you know, it's still, I think, a concern back there. You know, should the federal government tighten the financial standards for the airlines, cash they need, or any in any other way, or is the market really taking care of that?
I think the latter. I think the market is taking care of that. I can't imagine. Can't really imagine that being required now, given economic conditions and the leadership of the airlines. It's a different generation of leaders now in charge of the airline industry, and I think they are financially savvy. And to me, the best evidence of that is their ability to maintain their disciplined approach to capacity. The reason airlines are making money today is that they are not overextended in capacity, which is unfortunate for us as travelers because it means all flights are full. On the other hand, you can't make money flying empty seats. So it's a matter of economics for them, and I think they don't need someone telling them that. They've figured it out.
Yeah, I remember right about the time of the commission, United Airlines, I think, announced a new flight into Delaware just to be able to say that they flew to all 50 states.
Yeah. Yeah, I think things have changed for the better there. But again, it does create customer frustration because they've got to make decisions on the basis of economics. And yet, at what point do you begin to lose customers or frustrate your traveling public because of a strictly economic decision? From a fiduciary point of view, they have an obligation to the shareholder. But from the public responsibility point of view, they have the responsibility of moving that passenger from one place to another as conveniently as possible and as safely as possible. And so you've got a mix here.
You know, one of our, I think we'd agree, one of our favorite commissioners, one with whom you had a number of interesting discussions over the 90 days was John Peter Paul. And I do have a question about John, but before I get into that, the specific question I have about his view of the industry, just maybe from a personal point of view. I think a lot of people looking from a distance, because John dissented from the report, issued a very lengthy dissent, almost as long as our report itself. A lot of people assume that maybe you and John were at loggerheads and didn't get along and so forth. I know you have a very different view of that.
Yeah, I like John. He was, I don't know how much formal training he had, but he was intellectually sharp, gifted speaker, passionate about his views, and I respected that. And I thought the chemistry between us was good. I don't have a problem with people who have a different point of view, as long as they know why they think the way they do, and they're not borrowing someone's talking points. You know, at least he had thought about it.
Yeah.
He didn't recite something that someone else in a different place had written for him to say. So John and I were, I think, very good friends, and I have a wonderful story that's too long to tell here, but I was very fond of him.
Yeah, I think part of that impression that people had may come from that whole Washington thing that's unfortunately developed over the last couple of decades, where if you disagree, you must not like each other or something. But it's it really was I think a good relationship.
Well, and you know, the discussions were civil and informed. They were engaging, and I think you learned from the testing of your ideas. At least I did.
Yeah. Let's talk about one of John's comments in his lengthy dissent. And you know, it was an interesting phrase. You know, the name of the commission was the National Commission to Ensure a Strong Competitive Airline Industry. And of course, we can talk at some point about whether we insured or whether the commission insured anything of the sort. But John's comment in his dissent was that perhaps it was not possible to have an airline industry that was both strong and competitive. That you know, the industry was susceptible to destructive competition. It would always be overly competitive. And Herb Kelleher sort of tacitly maybe agreed with that in some ways when he said, we can take the competitive part out of our charge because we already have that. That's the strength part that we have a problem with. Do you think that that's so? And do you think there's any way to conquer that?
Herb Kelleher was right in one sense, and that the airlines were competitive, but they were destructively competitive. And so the question was, how do you create the financial strength conditions? And there are a lot of reasons that go into trying to find an answer to that. But I think any airline today that has vision and the means with which to execute it has nothing to fear about a strong, competitive airline environment. Those who don't have the vision will perish because they won't have the means with which to execute that vision. They will just spend their money and their efforts in a variety of directions. So my view is that people like to talk about destructive capitalism, survival of the fittest. But in this business, you know, if you don't provide the service at a price that the public wants to pay, they will go somewhere else. So the challenge to the airline industry, the airlines in particular, is to provide a pleasant traveling experience at a price that people are willing to pay. And I think they're pushing the point on some of these baggage fees that are not making it a traveling experience pleasurable. But on the other hand, airlines need that financial strength. And so whether you put the price of travel in one package, or you slice it and dice it a number of ways, the bottom line still has to be the same. Without them making a profit, they can't provide the service. And without that, I think that particular airline's future is rather dismal.
You talked about the fees, just as an aside there. The fees weren't part of the landscape back then. And just to illustrate how much of part of the psyche they've become part of the landscape, I was on a international flight about a week ago. We were flying into it was to Jamaica, and flying into the airport in Montego Bay, and you had to fill out the Jamaican customs form. And I guess they didn't have a lot of extras. And so the flight attendant got on the loudspeaker and said to everybody, make sure you fill those things out correctly. There's a $5 fee if you don't. And looked around the plane. Nobody was laughing. Everybody was working more carefully. And so it was at least believable, that they might charge that fee. I wonder if that's sort of one of those ways that, as you said, the airlines finally looked at their product. What are they selling and how are they pricing it? And getting away from that whole market share approach that they've had for so long, and trying to figure out how to price their product in order to make it.
Well, and they're really responding to what happened with deregulation. Before that, the price was set by the CAB in Washington. This is where you can fly, and this is how much you can charge. For the airlines that enjoyed that operational practice, it may have given them a certain level of certainty, but there wasn't anything competitive about it. The situation you've just described is the airlines have finally figured out that if they're going to operate in a deregulated environment, choosing the routes they fly and the prices they charge will basically be their responsibility, whether they make a profit or not. They can't blame the government, although they do, for air traffic control and a lot of other factors that affect profitability. But pricing and routes are really the basis of the deregulation environment in which we operate. And frankly, they've got the responsibility to figure out whether just to charge you one flat fee, or in order to entice you to travel, give you a low fare and then do a bunch of add-ons.
I guess the way to a shorthand way to describe the change in mindset that you just talked about, I think, can be found in a conversation that I've heard you have with a number of airline CEOs over the years. And I remember one with Randy Babbitt when he was on the commission. Now the FAA administrator, was president of the Airline Pilots Association. And the driving force during the pre-deregulation era was market share. The government guaranteed you a market share. And it's taken the airlines a long time to get out of that mindset. I remember you would tell them it's not the size of your share of the market, it's the size of the market.
Yeah.
And their eyes would sort of glaze over like you had two heads.
Well, I think they've finally figured it out. I've never understood airlines talking about, and I guess we'll get into this shortly, about expanding market opportunities that come through deregulation, but looking at international arenas, for example. They don't want certain changes to be made until there's a level playing field. And they're more concerned about how that level playing field affects them than the industry. So to me, they're more interested in a level playing field than they are the size of the field, which is the same thing in a way of saying, if you want to expand your market share, you can't do it by restricting it. And therein lies an intellectual problem that I don't think too many people in the industry have, in the past, have confronted. I think the current leadership of most airlines today, they now understand that if you want to grow your market, you have to be in support of market expansion. You can't expand your market by restricting it.
Something you referred to earlier, at least hinted at, is a discussion that still sometimes occurs. Whether airlines are normal businesses, quote unquote, and should be treated as normal businesses, or whether they're really in some kind of way public utility. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, there's really not much to say. I mean, if you had to describe the industry today between a public utility model and a standard business model, to me the answer is clear. It's a standard business model. I mean, there are some warts on that model with some government regulation, but it doesn't fit the public utility model.
Didn't the very existence of the commission really in some ways express the willingness of the government to look at aviation as different, maybe not as a public utility, but as different in some way?
Well, it is. I mean, if you think about it, air traffic control is operated by the government, and there are public safety as well as congressional political reasons why that remains the case. But I am convinced that trying to deal with this in a way that gives clarity to it is very, very difficult. It may well be that we won't get a clear answer for some time to come, but I guess I've been puzzled about this for a long time, so I don't really have a very good answer.
Yeah, as we're in the few minutes remaining in this section, I think the government's view of its role of itself in the airline industry, especially the airline industry, the airport industry as well, and manufacturing maybe to a lesser degree, then the industry's view of what it wants from the government. It's always seemed to me that the airlines and the airports, frankly, have wanted the government out of their affairs until they wanted them into their affairs. And you can't really have, it's hard to have both.
Well, it is, and yet I guess the point I was trying to struggle with a moment ago is we talk about the airline industry being deregulated, and again, as we know, we're talking about routes and fares. But on the other hand, the government is still very much a part of the way airline industry operates. For example, if you run an airline, you cannot push away from the gate. You cannot taxi. You cannot take off. You cannot change your route. You cannot land. You cannot pull up to the gate without someone in government giving you the authority to make that decision. So nowhere else in the American industry is the operating efficiency of that business really determined by the operating efficiency of the government agency operating it. So on the one hand, it is different. But it's also different in another aspect. There's no other business like it that has such an impact on international trade and communications. The ability to move people and products from one continent to another in a matter of hours. It has a big impact on the economy, on travel, tourism. So I guess the point that I've been wrestling with is, on the one hand, we advocate deregulation of routes and fares. On the other hand, we are faced with government control of the operating decisions regarding the various aspects of flight. And we too often don't really make that distinction, and we don't quite comprehend or accept the impact of that on the industry itself. So it's an issue we're going to be wrestling with for a while.
Yeah, it sometimes seems to me that airlines and airports and others sort of sow the seeds of this a little bit. Again, they want that freedom, but then in tough times they want a tax break or they want a government grant, whether it was during the stimulus, this past time where airports did get some grants and the airlines wanted money to equip for air traffic control. And it always seems to me that the downside of industry wanting that is you're inviting the government further into your affairs,
Sure.
even while you want them away, and from a statutory point of view, they should be pushed away.
Well, it's unfortunately a part of human nature. We want what we want when we want it, as some people say. But it is clear that this is going to be an issue that governments and the airlines and airports will be dealing with, because there's a lot at stake. I mean, it's not just the profitability of airlines or the efficient operations of airports and investments in their infrastructure, but also public safety. And these sorts of things are not easy to sort out in black and white fashion.
I remember a conversation we had with Jim Wilding, the legendary former CEO of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority,
Yeah.
who talked about what is the aviation industry? Is it just the airlines, or is it wider than that? And I remember you talked about that. President Clinton talked about that as well at the first meeting. And what's the effect of the regulatory framework and all that? And sometimes we lose sight of, in the short term, is an airline profitable or not, or is an airport project being done or not? We lose sight of that bigger picture.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that would be helpful if we spent more time trying to deal with definitional issues. What is the aviation industry? And if you speak of it broadly, you talk about airlines and airports, but you also have to factor in the FAA and other forms of government regulation, protection. But you also have to factor in the question of international relations and the people who participate in those decisions. I remember at one point when we were talking about international arena, the negotiations, one of our recommendations was that our country rotates people in and out of international air service agreement negotiations. Whereas in most other fields of negotiations, you have a career person who's skilled in that field, who's knowledgeable about the players, who understands the big issues, constantly engaged in those negotiations over a long period of time, which expedites the negotiation process itself. But in international aviation negotiations, the State Department in the past and others have had sometimes junior level people serving in that position for that one set of negotiations, and then a new person handling the next round. And I remember being puzzled by that. Why we wouldn't see the importance of having skilled negotiators knowledgeable about the country and the other parties with which we're negotiating, understanding of the industry, being very skilled and discreet and persuasive in trying to negotiate an acceptable settlement of an issue. So when you talk about what is the aviation industry, you've got to look at more than just the major players, airlines and airports and the FAA. You have to look at other people who have an important role to play in how the industry operates.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes lost, and certainly I know one of the points you made the day the Commission report was released at the National Press Club was that the problem is a lot of these debates are too often conducted within the aviation industry, and there's not a wider, the business community is not involved, and we need to change that.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about to wrap up this segment. You touched on an important recommendation on the international side from the Commission, so we'll use that as a jumping off point for the next session.